It's more than 200 years since Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. But if you look closely, you can see this battle's name etched into the landscape of the United Kingdom and the wider world. It's given its name to cities across the globe. ABBA wrote a song about it. And in 1970, Sergei Bondarchuk produced an entire movie telling the story of the battle. Yet for historians of the period, there's a problem. Most of what people think they know about Waterloo is actually wrong. From my office at the University of Portsmouth, I began digging deeper into the Waterloo story to try to separate the myth from the historical reality.
Normally, when people talk about Waterloo, there are only some basic things that ever get mentioned. For a start, it's always said that Napoleon's army is defeated by a British army under the command of the British Duke of Wellington. Napoleon's first attack with infantry is defeated by a British heavy cavalry charge. Napoleon's own cavalry are then wasted by Marshal Ney, who seems to lose all tactical awareness and just charges headlong at the British line. And then Napoleon's final desperate attempt to break the British with his elite Imperial Guard gets beaten by the British Guard.
The trouble is, when you start to scratch the surface of what really happened, you quickly realise that things don't add up.
For one thing, Wellington's army wasn't the only force that Napoleon had to face. There was a second Allied force under the command of this guy, Gebhard von Blücher, commanding a Prussian force that was even bigger than Wellington's. And even Wellington's force wasn't actually that British. Only a third of his troops came from the British Isles.
So an entire army has been virtually forgotten from the Waterloo story. But amazingly, there's much more.
The story that most people are told about Waterloo is the story of the final day, the battle that was fought on the 18th of June at Waterloo. But there is actually a much wider Waterloo campaign. Napoleon had invaded 4 days earlier on the 15th of June, and over the course of this frenetic campaign, he fought 4 battles. 3 of them generally get pushed to the sidelines of the Waterloo story.
With the role of entire nations being downplayed, and people often barely talking about 3 of the 4 battles, it's clear that looking at the Waterloo campaign in its entirety could revolutionise how people understand what happened. In order to retrace these men's footsteps, I'm heading out to Belgium to see the battlefields of the Waterloo campaign for myself. But before I even leave the country, I stumble across a reminder of just how big a deal Waterloo was in the years after the battle. In London's Waterloo railway station stands this monument. Hundreds of people walk past it every day, but most of them probably don't realise that embedded within it is an important clue about the battle's importance. It's a replica of something called the Waterloo Medal, which was given to every British soldier who fought in the campaign. To understand its significance, I needed to speak to Dr Luke Reynolds, an expert on the way in which Waterloo was remembered in the years after Napoleon's defeat.
Hi Luke, Zack White here, how are you doing?
Zack, what do I owe the pleasure?
So I've just been looking at the Waterloo Memorial in London Waterloo Station, and in the heart of it there's this disc that is the Waterloo Medal. What's the deal with the Waterloo Medal?
It was a campaign or battle medal, as we would recognize today, issued to every soldier, regardless of rank, that participated in the Waterloo campaign. It was designed by Thomas Wyon Jr., who had just finished designing Britain's new silver currency, and had actually been proposed by the Duke of Wellington himself.
Why is it important?
It was the first campaign medal that the British Army issued to everyone regardless of rank. This is not a new concept. Continental armies had been doing this, the East India Company army had been doing this. But the British themselves felt it was gauche. They felt that a campaign medal was rewarding soldiers for what they were already being paid for, and that medals should be given out for special actions instead. So the medal is the first time the British give out a campaign medal to everyone present at an action, or in this case, at a 4-day campaign.
But what about the people who'd fought in other battles during the period? Do they get any recognition?
They were bare-chested. They had to wait 30 years for the Military General Service Medal.
So what you're saying is that this is really important?
It threw the weight of the British Army and the British state behind the notion that Waterloo was special, that it was exceptional, that it was a watershed. It also set a standard. After the Waterloo Medal and the Waterloo Campaign, Britain started issuing campaign and battle medals to all ranks.
So the British clearly recognised that what their troops had achieved at Waterloo was hugely significant. Yet as I arrive in the town of Waterloo, just south of Brussels, I quickly find evidence of a mixed picture when it comes to remembering the troops from other nations who fought alongside the British. This is the Church of St Joseph. Situated opposite the old inn that Wellington used as a headquarters the night before the Battle of Waterloo, today it houses monuments to many units who fought in the campaign. Looking at these memorials embedded in the walls of the church, the scale of this battle begins to hit home. British, Dutch, French, all are remembered here, but I can't help noticing that an entire group of people are missing. The Germans. Even if we put the Prussian army to one side for a moment, the contribution of troops from the area of modern-day Germany at Waterloo was substantial. Wellington's army was more of a European force than a British one. British and Dutch Belgian troops each made up about a third of Wellington's force, but almost a quarter of it, around 23,000 men, were Hanoverian troops, or men from the King's German Legion. Raised in the wake of the French occupation of Hanover earlier in the conflict, the King's German Legion had gained a reputation as a formidable force made up of Hanoverian expats dedicated to serving King George III. And then there was the Brunswickers, 6,000 men, also drawn from the area of modern-day Germany, who made up an entire brigade in their own right. With the idea that Waterloo was just a battle between the British and French thoroughly debunked, but with much more to find out, I turn my attention to another gap in the saga. One of those battles that people never talk about. I head south to a dot on the map that few people have heard of, but was every bit, if not more important, than Waterloo. This is the battlefield of Quatre Bras. Translating as the Four Arms, this crossroads was the linchpin of the Allied plan for the Waterloo campaign. The road heading north-south was the main highway to Brussels. The one running east-west connected Wellington's and Blucher's forces. They needed this road to remain open so that they could stay in contact with each other. Before the Waterloo campaign even started, they'd come up with a strategy that wherever possible, they would fight combined. Napoleon had around 128,000 men with him. Wellington's force was a little smaller, 106,000 men, but Blucher had 128,000. If the Allies worked together, they could overwhelm Napoleon with sheer weight of numbers. It was a strategy that they knew worked. After all, they'd defeated Napoleon before. Napoleon had risen to power in a coup in France in 1799. Sweeping away the old French revolutionary government, he had ruled France first as consul and then from 1804 as emperor. Although an exceptionally talented military commander who had proven his skills at battles such as Marengo and Austerlitz, he had also been the architect of his downfall. His disastrous attempts to take over Spain and Portugal led to the Peninsular War, the conflict in which Wellington made his name by defeating the French in key battles, such as Salamanca in 1812, depriving Napoleon of men that he needed to control the rest of his European empire. When the Emperor's invasion of Russia went horribly wrong, leading to him losing 90% of his 500,000 strong Grande Armée, the other nations of Europe smelt blood, forming a coalition against him. By 1814, the once all-conquering Emperor of the French had been forced into exile on the island of Elba. But Napoleon wasn't going to give up so easily. As soon as he heard that the Allies had started to squabble amongst themselves, he launched an audacious return. Landing on the south coast of France in February 1815 with just 1,000 men, he was able to topple the new French King Louis XVIII, re-establishing himself as ruler of France. The Allies could not take this lying down. They declared war on Napoleon himself and began amassing a huge force of 750,000 men. Napoleon's only hope was to strike before the Allies were ready and try to eliminate the two armies closest to him, those under Wellington and Blucher. Napoleon seemed to have lost none of his strategic skill, quickly realizing that there was a narrow gap between the areas where Wellington's and Blucher's armies were quartered. If he could force his army down that gap, he could prise the two forces apart before picking them off separately. It was a bold plan that came incredibly close to working. The key to it all was Quatre Bras. On the morning of the 15th of June, Napoleon's men streamed across the border into southern Belgium. The Allies were caught off guard. It took their armies a day to assemble, but Napoleon had already managed to get a day's head start. In the hours that followed this French invasion, it was the decisions made by the Dutch and Prussian commanders and the tenacity of Dutch and Prussian troops, which would buy the Allies precious hours, that kept their plans alive. Within half an hour of crossing the border, the French were fighting Prussian outposts, which quickly pulled back in the face of the overwhelming French numbers. Letters were urgently sent up the chain of command, with the commander of Prussian First Corps, von Zieten, warning his boss, Marshal Blucher, of what was happening. But for the Allies, confusion reigned. The direction of the French attack was so unexpected, they couldn't tell if this was a feint. Blucher decided to take no chances. By 11 AM, he ordered his army to gather at Ligny, but the Allies were far from out of the woods. Wellington still knew nothing. His forces were spread across the Belgian countryside, clueless that the French army was bearing down on them. It wouldn't be until midday that Blucher wrote warning that the French invasion had begun. By 3 PM, the Prussians had been forced out of Charleroi, enabling the French to keep pushing north. Napoleon's plans were starting to take shape. But within the French camp, the Emperor himself was already sowing the seeds of confusion. He had decided to give the left wing of his army to Marshal Ney. Nicknamed the bravest of the brave, this fiery Marshal of France was hugely respected and was known for leading from the front, but also had a reputation for getting carried away in the heat of battle. Ney and Napoleon met in Charleroi at 4:30 PM on the 15th of June. Giving Ney the 1st and 2nd French Corps, Napoleon told him to move north, but this was the first that the Marshal had heard of it. Ney therefore had to scramble to work out where on earth his men were deployed, where their commanders were situated, and how best to contact them. Despite what Napoleon later claimed, he also did not order Ney to take the crossroads at Quatre Bras. As the Emperor didn't know where the Allied army was going to concentrate, the road from Quatre Bras to Ligny was just one of many that the Allies might take, so he had no idea which crossroads would be the most crucial. That realization wouldn't hit Napoleon until 6 AM the following day, when he wrote an order to Ney telling him that the crossroads had to be taken. Ney would make many mistakes over the course of the campaign, but the claim that he was at fault for not taking Quatre Bras on the first day is one of many myths of the campaign. Despite this, the French nearly took the crossroads regardless. They were only stopped by the initiative of this man, Prince Bernhard Saxe-Weimar. In command of a brigade of Dutch troops, he could hear the cannon fire as the Prussian rearguard streamed out of Charleroi and pulled back towards Ligny, leaving the highway to Brussels undefended. Acting without orders, he played a hunch, knowing that the French were just a few miles to the south and that Wellington's basic plan had been to gather at Nivelles, a few miles west of Quatre Bras. It was clear that the crossroads was going to play a vital part in the campaign and had to be held. He therefore ordered 3 battalions from the 2nd Nassau Regiment to occupy the area around the crossroads. The brigade arrived at 7 PM in the nick of time. Pushing north from Frasnes were the advance guard of Ney's troops. This cavalry force immediately went on the offensive. General Lefebvre-Desnouettes, their commander, reported back to Ney. When we reached Frasnes in accordance with your orders, we found it occupied by a regiment of Nassau infantry, some 1,500 men, and 8 guns. As they observed that we were manoeuvring to turn them, they retired from the village where we had practically surrounded them with our squadrons. General Colbert even reached within musket shot of Quatre Bras on the high road, but as the ground was difficult and the enemy fell back for support to the Bossou Wood and kept up vigorous fire from their 8 guns, it was impossible for us to carry it. It may not sound like the fiercest of engagements, but the Dutch were so hard pressed by the French that by 9 PM as darkness fell, Saxe-Weimar wrote back to the commander of his division, General Propencher, that his men were down to just 10 rounds each and needed urgent support overnight if they were to hold their ground the following day. Propencher wrote back ordering Saxe-Weimar to hold the ground at all costs and promised to send reinforcements. Yet within the Allied camp, the confusion remained as the fog of war lay thick on their decision-making. Many of the key figures in the Allied army were at a ball hosted in Brussels by the Duchess of Richmond. Delays in communication caused by the fact that every message had to be sent by horse and rider meant that Wellington didn't get detailed news of the French attack until 6 PM. It was another 4 hours before the letter from Blucher arrived saying that the Prussian commander was preparing to stand and fight at Ligny. In the meantime, the Prince of Orange, an inexperienced young officer who had been given his position due to the fact that he was the heir to the throne of the Netherlands, had written to his chief of staff saying that the men could go back to bed as there hadn't been any fresh developments. That chief of staff, the Comte de Rebec, would be the second member of the Dutch-Belgian contingent who would use their initiative to keep hope alive for the Allies. As orders came in from Orange to stand down and from Wellington to concentrate at Nivelles, Rebec focused on the situation at Quatre Bras. He knew that the French were there and that Nivelles would be useless if the crossroads fell. He therefore wrote to the Dutch-Belgian divisional commanders, telling General Propencher to head to Quatre Bras and Chasse to head to Nivelles. Later that night though, confused by reports that he was getting, Rebec told Propencher to march to Nivelles regardless. Propencher ignored those orders and instead sent more men to reinforce Saxe-Weimar. It was a decision that kept the campaign alive for Wellington's forces, ensuring that there were men in place to meet the initial French advances on the 16th of June, preventing them from simply walking up to the crossroads and splitting Wellington's and Blucher's armies. Propencher's initiative meant that the fighting could go on, making the rest of the Waterloo campaign possible for the Allies. He is quite literally one of the unsung heroes of the Waterloo saga. In the next episode, the Allies hatch a plan and commit once again to the principle of fight combined. The fighting begins in earnest at Quatre Bras, and Wellington's army begins to crumple under the strain. If you've enjoyed this episode of Waterloo by Air, make sure you like and subscribe to see the next instalment of the series. If you'd like to learn more about the Waterloo campaign, I recommend Gareth Glover's book Waterloo, Myth and Reality. And you can listen to much more about the history of the period on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. If you want to get exclusive and early access to the next episode of the show, head over to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod.